Hi, I'm Tom Paragi. I'm president of the Alaska chapter of the Wildlife Society, and it's June 15th, 2007, and we're in the home of John J. Burns Sr. in Fairbanks, Alaska. And for the Wildlife Society's program, Conserving Our Wildlife Conservation Heritage, we'll be interviewing John. So, John, I guess we want to start off with some of the real basic questions in terms of where were you born and when, and where was your early childhood spent?
Well, my folks lived in eastern Long Island, and my mother went to New York City, where I was born, and then, of course, back, and that's where I was born and grew up. That was very rural at the time. And what was the rest of that question?
Oh, where was your early years spent, your childhood? And
Eastern Long Island.
Okay. Was there any particular person or experience or place that had a real strong influence on your becoming interested in nature and wildlife?
Well, the place had absolutely an overwhelming influence on my interests in and attraction to working with wildlife. As I said, it was rural at the time. The community I grew up in was a commercial fishing and truck farming town.
What was the name of the town?
Amagansett, which is eastern end of Long Island. And the habitat at that time, or the surrounding country, was extensive salt marshes, tidal salt marshes, rich in all sorts of aquatic life, marine life at sea, and estuarian life inland. And many of the people that I came to know and associate with as friends were all involved to some degree or another in working in the bays or at sea. And I don't remember gravitating in that direction. I was just in it from as long ago as I can remember.
So were there any activities you did as a child or into your teen years that really kind of led you towards going into a career in biology?
Oh, I was one of those persons that knew what I wanted to do about the time I graduated from grade school. And I think it was strongly influenced by the activities of us young kids, which were seasonal, year-round, and changed with the seasons. We used to, as kids, to make pocket money, catch minnows for the sport fishermen, catch eels and blue claw crabs because they were available. We never wanted for money. All you had to do was get off the couch and go to work. And we trapped muskrats in the fall, hunted ducks because that was an incredible place for both sea duck hunting and puddle ducks, black ducks in particular. And so the whole cycle was involved with nature, all seasons.
Okay. I guess maybe I missed earlier. What year were you born?
1938.
Okay. Well, when and where was your academic training when you eventually got out of high school and went to college?
Well, let me follow up with one of the changes that really influenced me was starting maybe in 1949 or 1950. What was an absolutely beautiful setting started to become sort of a bedroom a series of continuous bedroom communities for an expanding city population. And people moved out of the city. I watched Levittown being built, which was beautiful for many people, especially the young folk coming back from World War II. Gave them many chances. But those beautiful pictures of new communities being built and opportunities were just the kiss of death for the wild places. And that had a hard impact. I mean, I watched the marshes get chopped up and channelized and filled in and houses built, and I don't know, that registered real early, even by the time I was about 14. I started working at sea when I was 14, and that wasn't far enough away.
So you're commercial fishing?
Commercial fishing, yeah.
Okay.
I wasn't. I was just a young crewman. And that incident, all of these incidents tie in. I see nothing unusual about it. I see it as sort of in a track or a rut that just naturally led in one direction with almost no alternatives. One of my first real summer jobs, I should back up, I went to an agricultural high school, and their requirement was 4 summers of working on farms. Well, my first summer, I was a freshman in high school, I was sent to upstate New York and a dairy farm. And my greatest memory of that event, actually my 2 greatest memories of that event, were spending essentially the whole month of August walking around inside a silo, tamping down silage as it poured down on my head. And it gave me bad dreams even, because I would dreamed about tripping or falling or getting stalled in there and this stuff just burying me. Well, I had negotiated then, even as a kid, with my major teacher, Mr. Price, played a major role in my life. He was a black man, graduated from Tuskegee Institute, an absolutely wonderful person. That was that was an interesting situation in the early 1950s. But he sort of fanned the flames. But anyway, I talked with him and I said, farming's not for me. I have to leave this school. The requirement is 4 summers working on a farm. I want to go fishing. So he didn't answer me at the time. And several weeks later, he says, well, farming and fishing are quite much alike. And he said, I think you can spend your summers fishing and that will meet the qualifications, which is exactly what I did. Another event that influenced me greatly was the second summer of fishing. One of my neighbors pointed me towards a vessel called the St. Peter. It's not relevant to this, but the captain was Polish, from Poland, John COWCH. I remember him very, very well. And he was a legal alien in the United States. He was allowed here. His family was completely annihilated during the Second World War. He lost his wife, his children, everything. He finally got to the United States. And I had minimal skills on draggers at the time, but he desperately needed somebody who was a citizen that could obtain a restricted radio telephone operator's license, which allowed him to be able to talk on his boat. And so I got that. I still have it. I still use it. It's part of the boat and plane gear, and I think that was issued in maybe 1953, and I still have it, and it's still valid. But COWCH really introduced me to the delight of foreign languages. As I said, he spoke Polish, a little Russian, and tried to teach me Polish. I didn't learn very much then, but sort of awakened kind of an interest in a foreign language that had use, not just Church Latin. Mm-hmm. And what I'm saying is all of these things just there were almost no conscious decisions as to where I was going. It just evolved. I enjoyed it. It was good, honest, hard work. My friends were very active baymen, not mariners. And as I said, we never wanted for cash. The resources were abundant. Little did we know they were going to be decimated in the near future, but at that time it was very, very good. And your question was, where did I go from there? From Long Island, I went, after I graduated from this agricultural high school, I went to North Carolina State. And North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina.
And what year was that?
Well, I graduated in 60. I went probably in 55. It's interesting. I loved the sort of biology courses, and I didn't like too much. And my advisor at the time, who also played a major role in my life, told me I should drop out of school, that I was wasting my time, and I was not focused, and I should join the Army and figure out what I wanted to do and come back when I was ready, which was sound advice. Now they won't do it. These are now factories, big money here. In those days, I think they were more inclined towards academic excellence, and it was a different time and a different approach, shall I say. Well, anyway, I didn't join the military. I went back north and got a job on a distant water trawler. The Gannet was the name of that trawler, and
this is based out of Long Island?
It was based out of New Bedford and Boston and Gloucester, and its home port, which we were rarely at, was a place called Baldwin Harbor, which no longer exists as a harbor. It's all condominiums now. But that was an introduction into distant water fishing. I loved it. I met my wife-to-be during that period of time. I stayed on that vessel as my wife, 3 times married, the same woman, reminded me and still reminds me that in the first year we were married, I was at sea 305 days. Well, anyway, my wife became pregnant, and between my father and she and my godfather, I was born in the Catholic Church. Not that I'm devout at the moment, but that's neither here nor there. But in again those times, there were great responsibilities of godparents, and you'd have to understand a bit of that. Anyway, my godfather was the one that was responsible for supposedly looking after my spiritual life. And he and my father, my godfather was my father's brother, convinced me that I definitely should go back to school, get a good education, put those tools in my tool bag, and then come back to fishing if I so chose. But if I remained commercial fishing, that I would have no option to go to school if I stayed there long enough. But if I went to school, I could exercise many different options. His advice was well taken. My responsibilities changed my focus on things, and so I went back to North Carolina and got serious about it. As I said, I grew up trapping on eastern Long Island, and that continued into college because I got a part-time job with a professor who actually also influenced me greatly and got me here to Alaska.
And what was his name?
His name was Bernard Harkema, and he was a parasitologist, and he was stationed up here in Fairbanks, as a matter of fact, during and shortly after the Second World War, working on zoonotic diseases. As you know, during the war there was a great effort to ensure public health issues. Zoonotic diseases were his interest, especially parasites, of which we have many, including rabies and schistosomiasis and echinococcus and all of those sorts of things. So I ended up getting a scientific collecting permit, as it was a sophomore then, a scientific collecting permit, and trapped 12 months a year in North Carolina, mostly, not intensive trapping. He was working on life cycles of various parasites, so he was interested in securing live animals, dead of course for necropsy and looking at things, but mostly studying life cycles and transmission of diseases in North Carolina. And it was many interesting things with raccoons and with possums and all sorts of critters like that. And I also worked for a physiologist. I became very, very, very much motivated in biological sciences after I returned to the University of North Carolina. And in my senior year, it was an interesting decision because the physiologist I was working with was working primarily with laboratory rats as the model animals, doing cancer research, tumor research. He was an incredible instructor. I had very good professors in North Carolina. And he wanted me to continue in graduate school at North Carolina. And Dr. Harkema, who knew a lot about my interests and my temperament and my personality and that sort of stuff, said, "You will die in the laboratory at the age of 55. He says, "There's no end to that." He says, "You should go to Alaska." I point out here that I really disliked North Carolina. It was not my cup of tea.
The climate or the
climate,
culture?
the setting, everything about it. It was, and being far inland probably had a lot to do with it. But my wife and I had our first child when I was an undergraduate at North Carolina State University. Well, anyway, Dr. Harkema, as I said, encouraged me to come up here. I wasn't so sure about it. I applied to one university, which was the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. I was accepted and came up here in June of 1960, according to my wife, for 2 years. And then we were gone. She didn't like it at first. And so when I arrived, someone, for reasons I don't know, had already decided what my master's thesis project would be. I guess with the background coming in, and that was to be an ecological study of mink in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, which is what I did as my master's. And
now, were you in the Cooperative Wildlife Research?
I was in the Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit.
Okay.
And it was a very, very nice setting to be. Dr. Harkema's comments to me, which I found to be in part correct, where he says, "You will not be studying under the big name leading edge scientists in this nation, but you will be working in the most phenomenal field laboratory that exists." I remember that very well, what he told me. And when I started out, I got here probably on June 3rd or 4th in 1960, and by the 15th, the leader, the Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit leader at the time was Dr. Robert Scott, and he had made arrangements with one of the people that worked for Fish and Wildlife Service at the time, who lived in Minchumina years ago. He had made arrangements with Ray Tremblay, who was stationed at the time in McGrath, to accompany him all around the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. I had no idea whatsoever, didn't know where to begin, where to focus, where to concentrate my effort, how to go about it, no idea whatsoever.
So the project was broadly ecology of mink?
Dr. Scott walked up to a Series E map on his wall, took his hand, and he said, "This is your study area." And he covered the whole YK Delta. And there are other undercurrents that go on at this time, but so that was it. I didn't know what side was up. But he did point me to Ray. We spent about 3 weeks flying everywhere in the YK Delta. Ray was on normal patrol and doing some waterfowl work and meeting people. We met in those years. All of the Alaska Commercial Company stores had fur buyers. Fur was big time. Those mink were the most valuable mink in all of North America, perhaps the world. They're huge, good quality. They were produced in great numbers down there. So they were an important resource at the time. And so, Ray had the foresight, and he knew everybody. He knew absolutely everybody. And so we stopped in every place, from Antioch to Bethel to he was also Catholic and knew every priest down there, and they have pretty good insight into things, and I'm sure if I was Presbyterian or Moravian, it would be the same route. But anyway, just sort of, as we say today, networking. And about July of 1960, I settled on locating my field operation near the village of COWCH, which is out on the tundra. People refer to themselves as Agulami, tundra people. They're not river people, they're not coast people, they're tundra people. And so I went down there. I was going strong by August of that year. Things were very, very open. People, this is what, I don't know how many years ago, 47 years ago. It's a very different world then. Very receptive. I would say that growing up on Long Island and a few other things made me not even think about differences. People were people. I worked as a kid and grew up as a kid with gypsies. Worked for COWCH, as I said, and it was kind of an eclectic array of people, all of which they spoke different languages, did different things. So in that setting was, hey, this is where we are, this is how it is, and it was great. And there was a young boy that, as happens many, many times in many, many places, that came with me, and we sort of tented together and fed the mosquitoes, and the main task at the time, the first summer, was to live capture mink, the live trap mink, and mark them, and we didn't have radio calls, we didn't have anything, these were all ear tags, and let them go. And in the process, we caught tens and tens and tens, probably 100 weasels, least weasels. And
using foothold traps? Or?
No, we used I started with wire traps and had a very hard time keeping mink alive with wire traps. They fight in it, and mink actually are very susceptible when they get damp and wet and ruffled up. So I ended up making wooden box traps with a big coffee can back full of straw, so they were sheltered in it. And mink were super abundant down there. I don't know if you really know much about that neck of the woods, and pretty easy to catch. And so that went on, and then the fall, I went down there in the fall and was sampling the mink caught by local trappers. Worked with two guys at a COWCH who were very good trappers. We lived in a barabara. It was dog team days. Was exposed. The oddity was they never used a single steel trap. None. They made traps, taluya, modified fish traps.
The submarine, so-called
and
submarine?
They're all set underwater, and they're very good in the sense that if a mink is caught, it doesn't stop another one from coming in. I remember pulling one trap up that had 11 muskrats and 4 or 5 mink in it. So
were those like conical shaped?
Yeah, just like a split willow blackfish trap. So the thesis topic was the ecology and management of mink in the YK Delta, and so I got into collecting lots of carcasses, the normal thing, looking at age structure, looking at food habits, looking at you couldn't do age and growth because we really didn't catch any young. It's not a population sample. It's very, very focused, but all of the normal parameters. Reproduction through placental scars. You're familiar with every one of these things. It's very common. But just building up what information. Food habits were the most important. In the region, if you ever go back and look at it, you can't walk 80 yards in any direction without being in a pond or a lake. Mm-hmm. And they're interconnected. Blackfish are the dominant freshwater species, which we caught first. The task of the autumn trapping season was to catch sacks and sacks and sacks of blackfish, which were fed to the dogs, which we ate primarily and brought back to the village. But it's those blackfish which are the primary source for mink. And I could spend, an hour or two just talking about the relationship and how the trapping is focused on that connection between blackfish and mink as prey. All right. So that was all with the native folks down there, and there was somebody looking around that actually he in a way became a mentor, a tormentor, and a mentor. I came back at the end of my second year, in summer of 1961. And there was a fellow passing through. It was in August, and because I was going to go back again in the autumn to the YK Delta. James Washington Brooks, Jim Brooks. We have become very, very close friends right up until his death. And lots of names you know. Sam Harbaugh had been stationed in Nome and resigned from the department to go back to school. And lo and behold, he also did his master's work on mink. And lo and behold, he went back to North Carolina State University to study statistics. I had just come from North Carolina State University. Well, Jim was recruiting or trying to find somebody to go to Nome. Well, the position was empty. So he approached me. Our office was up in an old building on campus at the time. And I don't know, Fred Dean probably had a role to play in it. And he wanted somebody to work on marine mammals who might have a chance to work very, very closely with native peoples. And so the 2 years working in Cosiguluk and Nunapichuk and those communities apparently were viewed as some sort of experience that was suitable. And so
this job was with the new State Department of Fish and Game?
Brand new State Department of Fish and Game, Alaska Department of Fish and Game. I had worked with all those guys. In fact, attended the board meetings when we made Tuluiaks, those traps, legal. They were illegal in territorial days. And, of course, everybody trapped with them anyway. And so I had experience with the Board of Fish and Game. It was one board at the time, starting from the beginning, the first year in 61, that winter. I knew the Fish and Game folks, and my office was in the Fish and Game office at the time, which was on campus. And, lots of connections. And
the department was fairly small back
then.
Very,
very small. Just started. And wonderful opportunity. And as I say, you see how these things just sort of keep falling. Not much deviation from the rut. So by that time I had 2 children, a wife, and no job, graduate student. And the position was in Nome. And the office had been closed for a year after Sam Harbaugh left. And I agreed. And going to Bering Strait and the Maritime Islands, after the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, was like going from your garden into a supermarket. And the people were very, very nice, very open in those years, very much tied to the resources that they could harvest. Very interested in marine mammals, and it was another one of these things that sort of fell into place. It tightened my connection and interest in this nexus of maritime folks and the marine mammals they depend on, and so that started in 1962, late 1962. And became a more and more burning focus, interest, and continues to this day. So I worked with marine mammals for the state of Alaska. I eventually ended up here as a sort of a, how shall I put it? My wife, we spent many, many years in Nome. And we felt it was time for the kids to go to at least high school in a larger community, and for my wife at the time to enjoy things other than being left alone in Nome while I was traipsing around the St. Lawrence and King Island and Diomede and having a great time, and spending the winters in the office going, sectioning and reading thousands of walrus teeth and seal teeth. And so I came back here. As I said, the department was accommodating. It seemed very unlikely to be involved in marine mammal research from Fairbanks. But on the other hand, at the time in the early 70s, we were doing more and more work related to oil development and maritime commerce, so that it was just as easy to get from here to the Beaufort Sea as it was here to the Bering Sea or the COWCH Sea, and at least that was the rationale that I sort of used.
So what year did you come to Fairbanks?
72. I went back to school in 72 here. I worked on a PhD degree with the Institute of Arctic Biology. And that turned out to be mostly a real torturous event, because when I got to the Institute of Arctic Biology, really what they wanted me to do was to organize and lead a research cruise involving 2 ships, the Alpha Helix and the U.S. Coast Guard Gutted Glacier, and trying to pursue academic studies and organize that big expedition were really difficult. So my wife at the time didn't really gain much as far as time. Anyway, at that time we had the state of Alaska had no longer had this educational leave program in effect, and there was good reason for that, because when they did institute it in the early years, many of the people who you know of took advantage of it, got their advanced degrees, mainly PhD degrees, and then left, took university positions everywhere else. So I think there was legitimate reason to question whether it was wise for them to invest time and money to get people to leave. It wasn't a good deal for those of us that were serious about staying. It was not. Anyway, that had been that program came to an end before I did, so I ended up working and going to school simultaneously. I mean, I was on educational leave, but I couldn't, got no encouragement from the state, and with the marine mammal end of things. Anyway, it was a tough time. The cruise came off.
The primary focus of the cruise was marine mammal research.
That's right. That was really the very first breakthrough with the graduation from kayaks and skin boats as the mode of transportation, and handling everything by hand with native hunters, which I dearly, dearly loved. But there were limitations to what one could do, and when it started to evolve towards better logistic support, the nature of the studies changed very drastically. And then I think it was maybe in 74, 75, there was a big push whenever the Arab oil embargo came into effect. Maybe that was 73. There was a big push to develop the outer continental shelf areas for hydrocarbon reserves. And that generated a huge amount of interest and great expansion of our marine mammal program. I hired many people at the time, funded by the Outer Continental Shelf Environmental Assessment Program, and the logistics were just absolutely phenomenal. From these are ships that would now cost $70,000-$80,000 a day, helicopters on board, all kinds of support, and it was a new, focused program, a very great deal, and that there were many people that had done very great work in the course of that program. Lowry and Frost, as an example, gentlemen, but they came on in most of these people came on in 75.
During that era, was the Fish and Game was working quite a bit on marine mammals. Then, did the Marine Mammal Protection Act in 1972 change the research into things that much?
It was an absolute total change. The Marine Mammal Protection Act was very, very well intended and has had some very, very negative impacts. Cook Inlet beluga whales, which we may or may not ever get to in this discussion, but basically it provided the opportunity for states to resume management. It stripped every coastal state of management responsibility, and no Department of Fish and Game or Wild Conservation Department is going to invest big bucks in studying animals that they do not have a management responsibility for. And the reason is not that they just turn their backs on it. The reason is that there are always overwhelming needs for available funds to meet their mission. And we kept the program going for decades after that, basically on soft money. We had a good staff, very good scientists, all of those things. So we became contractors to the federal government. When you get to the management side of it, management of marine mammals was split by the Marine Mammal Protection Act between two federal agencies, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. And furthermore, within those services, it was split between their research branch and their management branch. So management had, certain responsibilities and an enforcement branch. So there were three branches, and there was a little lack of communication. And the procedures for actually doing management changed drastically in the sense of you had to have federal bills, and you had to have very lengthy procedures to follow, and long. You couldn't actually respond in a short period of time. And that's in fact what led to the near decimation of blue whales in Cook Inlet, which is the most unfortunate thing in the world, because I'm jumping ahead now, current in 2000, to knowing exactly the rate of decline, the cause of decline, the biology of the beluga whales, which we had resolved years and years ahead of time, and yet no action. And now they probably, it's 50-50 whether they will persist, because the population has been reduced to such low numbers that it's simply chance strandings and killer whale predation, and there's no hunting and none of that sort of stuff. But they have come below the threshold level for population perpetuation. It's worse than the normal predator trap, which many species emerge from over long periods of time when the predators disappear. Mm-hmm. This is a little more, it's worse than that. But anyway, it's a fatal lethargy of the bureaucratic mind, the inability, and that's the future. It's happening now with walruses right now as we speak, but as I said, that model is not working, and it won't be changed in my lifetime. So that's an unfortunate situation. On the other hand, at the state level, if you look at salmon management in Bristol Bay, that's a day-to-day operation. It's managed on a daily basis, totally dependent upon escapement goals, adequate escapement goals, responsive in very short time. You shut it down when it needs to be shut down. You don't open it until you get your recruitment. How do I go on in this conversation? Why don't you ask a question too? I'm getting lost. We're way back. We should probably stay back in the 70s at the time.
Right. You were describing how you had been doing marine mammal research on the based out of Nome, and then you moved into Fairbanks and started a PhD program where you also had responsibilities for the cruises.
Well, the first responsibility that weighed the heaviest was when I was trying to work on my PhD degree. I mean, there was just some conflicts for time that were just almost unmanageable.
What facet of marine mammals were that on?
That was an integrated cruise. There were probably 13 different institutions, including us. I was the chief scientist. It was trying to herd cats or something like that. Some very, very great things were done. My interest was in ribbon seals, and there was a medical team from Harvard University, actually, long story, that was interested in a problem with premature babies, and that's blue babies, in which they can't breathe because they're born prior to their functionality of the lungs. And we were in communication for about a year, and they wanted to be able to work with an animal that was easily obtainable and that was a deep diver. And because a seal, when a child is born and first expands the lungs, often with the help of the doctor slapping him in those big gasps and crying, the lungs are functional. They close and open, and they're functional in a young infant because they have, in the course of fetal development, developed that surfactant deposit, which which allows the lungs to collapse, which they never do completely after a child is born, but to reopen again. Mm-hmm. If you take two pieces of saran wrap and put them together, try pulling them apart. That's surface tension. Well, these guys, my interest was in ribbon seals, and of course they were interested in this. They didn't care what the animal was, but they wanted a diver, because those deep, long diving animals completely collapse their lungs. They don't take air down with them, otherwise they would suffer from the bends. Oxygen storage is something totally different. All of these things were what we were looking at, incidentally. This was mainly a physiology and ecology cruise. Mm-hmm. And I'm only picking one of 13 topics that were involved during this cruise. But so we were working on ribbon seals, collecting ribbon seals, and as one of the physiologists said, things were going to pieces because they were cut out. And
what time of year was this?
This was in spring. This was probably in 75 or 76. Remember, we were working on OCHEP money. They were working on grants from whatever they were.
And so you're following the ice retreat?
No, we weren't following the ice retreat. We had an icebreaker, and the Alpha Helix was a floating physiology lab, and we were up in the ice.
Okay.
And, well, anyway, I'm only highlighting one really exciting aspect of this whole cruise. There were many that were exciting for me, but they were able to collect this, it looks like foam, from the lung lining of ribbon seals. And they collected enough, which I thought was a minuscule amount, and took it back east, had the biochemists go over it over and over and over again, figured out what the protein composition of this was, and were able to synthesize it. And eventually produced what is still used to this day in the incubators of babies born in a certain time frame, because so they can breathe, because it was this surfactant which they use as a spray in the incubators that permitted the babies to breathe, because the lungs didn't always adhere to each other. So that was a real direct connection of our work with medical research. The other projects were diving physiology, were many things, and we were working on natural history. That twist got people like myself and Dr. Fay off into. When you're interested in when you're interested in understanding the ecology of a species, there are so many avenues of pursuit that are insightful with respect to the adaptation of that animal to its environment. Ecology means, as you well know, the relationship and functioning of an organism to its environment, including all the other organisms, including the physical, chemical conditions. My interest always was with adaptations to sea ice and ice-associated marine mammals. We don't have enough time to talk about all of this sort of stuff. Let me say that 3 or 4 things were operative in those times. Nome was great. You were interacting all the time, both in the local communities and as people passed through Nome, with people who were a significant functioning element of the ecosystem that I was involved in. They were knowledgeable, they were interested, they were accomplished. I mean, this is almost 3 generations ago. Still using traditional technology, still very, very close to the environment in the sense that they didn't have all of the equipment and technology that sort of removed them from it in a sense. They were an integral, significant, functioning element of what the time is with traditional technology. Which got me in trouble, of course, because I, with a close associate of the King Islanders, spent a lot of time working with the King Islanders, And it's no particular will. It's easier to just adapt the technology that's most useful in that time. Remember, these were all the pre-huge ship expeditions. It was skin boats, kayaks, foot, dog sleds, those sorts of things. And they all have their own learning curve to be able to handle and use. Well, shortly, maybe a couple of years after I acquired, let me back up again. When I was in Nome, and I see there's a lot of, things are very polarized now. I never thought much about it, but the first thing I did was to hire as an assistant a man from King Island, shortly after I got it, Anthony Kuzuna, wonderful, wonderful man. He's passed away. Who in the summer was a tugboat man. He worked for Loman Commercial Company. King Island, those people are born to the sea. They were born to the sea. I mean, look at a picture of the place. There's no way you go anywhere without being in the middle of the ocean. And, it was sort of a mutual give and take day after day after day after day. He was very interested. We were focused. He knew a lot. He knew a fantastic amount that could be gleaned. Let me back up. I consider those folks, one, as peers, and two, as scientists. And to determine who is a scientist, one must understand what science is. And I ask that of all my graduate students as a question. What is science? If you listen to a radio broadcast and they say, well, the scientist says, they have no idea in the world what a scientist is, because they have no idea in the world what science is. Just because I am described as a scientist, that doesn't mean every utterance I make on a subject is scientifically based. That's not true. So if you understand that science is a process, and that scientists are people who utilize that process to achieve some understanding, you get to where I'm coming at. So why are these folks scientists? They are scientists because they are. It's like a fishing captain, a very knowledgeable fishing captain. How does he acquire his understanding? By empirical testing, by observing, by committing to memory. If a person up north wants to survive by catching fish in the river, he has to have some understanding of what fish, where they live, where they travel, where they spawn, if they are interested very much in catching. All of these empirically derived bits of information that they can put together to maintain their livelihood. That's no different. That's science in the same way that we do it. We pursue different avenues of it based on different technologies and instrumentation and ask different questions. So the nexus between these folks and myself was absolutely great, because they could never determine how old the walrus was, although they had different words for different general age groups. But when it comes right down to the questions I was asking, how old are they when they first conceive? How frequently do they conceive? How long do they live? What are the food habits of animals at this age and this age and this age? I could determine age. I could identify the food habits. I was interested in things that, because they're not of immediate use to them, they're not focusing on. But many of the things they are focusing on were of very great interest. So that was a wedding that started with my initial work in the YK Delta, trying to figure out what side was up. You go to the experts. And, in those days, very, very cooperative. Well, to the end of my days in Nome, after Anthony Kuzuna, who ended up having enough kids that, he died in an accident. And then I hired another King Island man, Edward Montoyak, who stayed with the department until he retired. So that's a different time. I mean, now you're hiring about an inadequate number of this racial group and that racial group and everything else. But, these things were never even issues that came up. They were the natural course of things to do. I would much rather hire one of those persons than anyone else that would come there and have to start out from scratch. I mean, these were people in their 40s when I hired them, of the old school, well-trained, a strong work ethic. A lot of those things have changed now.
It may be worth mentioning, too, for posterity, the community of King Island no longer exists.
1969 was the last inhabitant on King Island. It's just too harsh a place, given what people, there were no hospitals, there's no access to it between October and late June. And people, they see better places. The King Islanders, actually, it didn't just abruptly stop. People started moving away from the island in the late 40s. And during the war, most of the men were either involved in the Alaska Territorial Guard or as longshoremen or in the service. And it was just a slow gravitation to jobs in the gold mining operation and longshoring and everything else. So it's slowly, it's like the community I live in the winter, and we're down 14 souls now.
I mean, Lake Minjumeno.
Yeah, but so the last family left in 1969. Ed McToyok, who I hired, lived there with his family until 1965. And what is culture? What is culture? I guess it's borders, it's language, and it's in its culture, and so they know that when they moved to the mainland as King Islanders, they were still a cohesive group, less and less so with intermarriage and movement to Anchorage and all that sort of stuff, but they were a very close community as King Islanders. One, because they were fierce and disliked. They spoke a different dialect. They were traditionally ferocious, hostile type seafarers, raiding on the Siberian coast, on the Alaskan coast, and everything else. But fantastic marine mammal hunters.
Now, the proximity of the Seward Peninsula is fairly close to the Russian mainland on the COWCH side. Did you have an opportunity to work with native people, marine mammal hunters on the Russian side?
Yes. My mentor, peer, co-worker, colleague, when I came back to Fairbanks was Dr. Fay.
Bud Fay?
Bud Fay. I told you before that COWCH, when I was probably 15 working on his boat, spoke mostly Polish and broken English and piqued my interest in languages. Harkema pushed me, probably when I was a sophomore at North Carolina State, to study Russian. Mm-hmm. I think he had a devious plan in mind, and
he knew where he was going to send you.
Yeah, and the majority of available information about the things that Fay and I were interested in was in the Russian language. And the house that you're sitting in, which was built by Dr. Rausch, the parasitologist, those guys pushed me very hard to study Russian. And I studied it starting in North Carolina State, continuing when I was a master's student here, continuing in Nome, because 13 out of 14 radio stations that I could receive on my short wave set were Russian language. Plus, the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church is great here, and the majority of the old Batushkas, priests, could speak Russian, albeit Church Slavonic, which is very different than modern Russian. And like I said, those things... they didn't take much conscious thought. You just sort of rolled along. The goal was out there. You didn't deviate too far. I used to get scolded when I became the statewide coordinator for marine mammal programs here in Alaska. Ron Skoog was the commissioner at the time, came up one day. He was in the office, and I was back in the lab. And he jokingly told me, he said, "What are you doing back here?" He said, "You're an administrator now. You shouldn't be back here." And but he had a good sense of humor, because he was a very good scientist in his day, if you followed the literature on caribou. And he says, you could be here between 5 p.m. and 8 a.m. and on weekends. The rest of the time, you'd be by your telephone. But the beauty of all of this was, especially in Nome, I'll use an old Russian saying, God is in heaven, the Tsar is in St. Petersburg, and I'm here. And we didn't have computers, and we didn't have the internet, We didn't have email. And so you could really focus, and which we did, which definitely we did. Good people, a good location, a burning interest in the subject, and great opportunities to pursue those interests. Times have changed.
Yeah. Now, so you took a leave of absence from your job to do your PhD program.
I was not a full-time leave. I was
Okay.
part-time, school part-time.
Okay, and that
There wasn't enough time. There weren't enough parts in that time. But anyway, it happened.
So that was in the mid 1970s.
It's in the early
1970s.
And at that time, it ties in. I was at the Institute of Arctic Biology. There were a whole group of students at the same time, all of which graduated and didn't have any goddamn place to go, excuse my profanity. And I guess they saw what was going on because, here's the Department of Fish and Game representative, which you normally think is just a state bureaucracy, with really good research biologists, focused, hardworking research biologists. And so a whole bunch of them all of a sudden developed an interest. And if you look at the years in which people were hired, you'll see a huge number of them that came from the Institute of Arctic Biology in 1972 and 73.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of this nexus. And perhaps the connection also was because even though I was a department representative, when I was working on that integrated research cruise, a lot of those people who were on that cruise were interested in various aspects of the physiology of marine mammals. Dr. Ellsmer and his Dr. Peter Morrison, who was the chairman of the Institute of Arctic Biology at the time. I mean, they came from all over the country. There was a real interesting anecdote. Remember, I come up from a pretty simple background, understand ocean a bit, and the life of a mariner and all that sort of stuff. But we had such a group of programs and people that competed for logistic time. About the third day on that icebreaker, as the chief scientist, the captain and the executive officer come down and they say, "I can see where this is going. This is not going to work." He says, "I have 4 or 5 different people coming to me directly, all want to be in different locations at the exact same time, all wanting a helicopter at the same time." I mean, this was a breakthrough. None of us have had that before, that kind of sport, unless you worked in the Antarctic. But in the Bering Sea and the Chukchi Sea. So they boiled it right down to something I understood. They said, "You guys, me, hold your meetings or designate somebody to hold the meetings. You work out through the day, no logistical conflicts. You bring them to my executive officer. We can drive." He told me, "This is a training, this is a kindergarten for kids. Look at these kids on the boat. They're 17, 18, 19 years old, except for my officers. He says, I'm training kids. I got my own worries. You just tell us where you want to be, when you want to be there, what you want to do, with no changing of your mind." He says, "You folks never stop changing your mind. You just run out of time to change it anymore." And I've used that as a lesson many times, in my fishing endeavors, So that's organization, right? And to the best they could, that was the first indoctrination that led us to many interactions with mariners who are very good at what they do, but we have a great ability to really screw them up if we don't think in terms that they need to know.
I think the same applies to working with helicopters or aircraft in a remote area too.
Anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we just took a break and we're talking, and it brings to mind one thing that I think, in the case of many of the people I know, is true. There is really not much of a separation between our professional and private lives, in the sense that it's almost like not going to work, in the sense that we're doing what we want to do, and our lifestyle is what we do, and I don't know whether that's good or bad. I don't know whether that's obsessive. I don't know whether that bends character in the wrong way, but I can't speak for others, but I can speak for myself, and that is my burning interest, and that is what my activities, thoughts, reading, actions are all about. However, there is a separation in the sense that my recreational pursuits, trapping, bird watching, building hunting equipment, even though they're sort of relaxation type pursuits, they're part and parcel of the bigger picture. And I don't know how to explain it. I don't know why I have to explain it, but they're all tightly connected.
I think it's important to capture that because at least my perception is I don't see that as much today in the wildlife profession. Sometimes we see people that obviously they like the outdoors, they like wildlife, but I see something more in your generation where the people that came up here to Alaska when it was a young territory and had the opportunities to, essentially go into a wide open field, interact with native people, which at that time, as you explained, they were still out primarily moving around by dog team or skin boat, pursuing a lot of the traditional hunting and trapping practices. It was an opportunity that today is much more difficult to take in for somebody, say, in my position. So that's what I find fascinating, and that's where some of the other questions I'd like to go through with the interview here would be to capture some of that interrelationship between your professional career and then some of your other pursuits that to the outside person may seem that they were very different, commercial fishing and trapping, but in fact they were kind of an extension of your strong interest in wildlife and ecology and things like that.
It was part of the seasonal rotation of activities.
Yeah.
Same lifestyle. I'll back up a little bit. I don't think those opportunities are lost. In fact, I know a young lady who works actually for the Department of Fish and Game now, who has taken the time and the interest and availed herself of the opportunities and is doing exactly those things. Without some really open-minded willingness to accept all of the differences, cultural, political, and everything else, but to accept them and try and understand them, of course, we end up on different sides of the street, so to speak. That's the way some people want it from all camps, but they're not real barriers if you scratch at them and work at them, which you will see, and which you learned when you were working probably in Galena. I don't know, I just never worried about those kinds of things, and, I don't know whether it's, I know very well-intended, very honorable, very energetic people that just can't quite seem to put others at ease for whatever reason, and I've seen others, including a lot of shysters, that can put everybody at ease, unfortunately. So, I don't know. I mean, we all associate with a group of people, especially up here in Alaska, and you've seen all kinds, and I tend to gravitate towards what I interpret as the more genuine, committed folks, willing to easily integrate with a whole cross section of different types and characters. I have never had any real difficulty. Avoid the people that you judge to be really difficult to deal with, and associate not with the easy folks to meet, because that's the other extreme, but work at trying to figure out who really. I don't know how to pursue this part of the discussion because there's no guidelines or anything else, but I think you and Karen maybe know what I'm trying to see. And you watch competent, successful, productive people, how they go about their business, how they choose their associates. It's not a matter of using people. It's a matter of partnering up and cooperating to the mutual benefit of the parties involved. And I think that's the secret. It has to be mutually beneficial to all of the folks involved. And if it is not, then it's not going to work out in the long run.
Yeah, I found that.
And how does that relate to science? I'm not talking about finances. That's also
Right.
part of getting into partnerships of financial dealings, but it's part of life. And and why we talk about something like this, because to pursue my interests, which are with ice-associated marine mammals primarily, you are interacting with and often dependent upon, in a mutual sense, with folks that occupy or live in the environment you're trying to work in. So you have to generate it's not only just mutual trust, it's much more than that. Trust is the basic and most important thing, because we are exposed to situations and instances which are often reportable law-breaking situations. I mean, you have to have some common sense.
Or it could be life-threatening if you're working in dangerous environments. And
we all work in a dangerous environment. And we've all been, the difference, again, it's no great skill on my part. I've just been fortunate enough to come through the events that could have been catastrophic, where colleagues have not. And it's just a flip of the coin.
Is there any one particular one maybe to capture for posterity, just sort of things that you were exposed to when working with marine mammals in terms of the sea environment? I'm sure there were many, but...
Well, let me put it to you this way. At this stage, anything that happens on land is a walk in the park. I don't care what it is, unless it's catastrophic,
Right.
falling out of the sky or something like that. You can prepare. You can put line camps in every 12 miles, which is a distance you can walk before you freeze to death if everything goes.
That's if you're running a trap line in the wintertime.
Right. I mean, you think, but the ocean is very, very unforgiving. The King Islands had the highest incidence of men lost at sea, either drowning in kayaks or being blown away on the ice. I went through that experience with Anthony. We survived it. And in an odd sort of a way, I would never do it again. Don't ever wish it on anybody, etc., etc.
This is where you were on the
out.
sea ice and it started to move.
Yeah, we were. I was very interested in bearded seals. It was late November. I would forget the year, 64 or 65. We were both competent kayak hunters, and we went across from the fast ice, which is hard for people to understand, across a very wide lead to the drifting ice. Started poking around out there.
The fast ice is attached to land.
Yeah. And the kayaks are not just watercraft. They have a kamigon, a sled in which they're put on for maneuvering across the ice. The hole in the front is what you hold and lead it. You tow it with a harness. And all of a sudden, just like the thunderstorm that came up this afternoon, we had a very, very fierce, sudden wind out of the north. And it was about 18 below zero. Calm when we started out, but it was not a problem of blowing the drifting ice farther from shore, which it was doing. It was a problem, which one doesn't think about unless you understand sea ice, of blowing all of the slush, which is constantly forming at 18 below in a thin layer, but of blowing it against the drifting ice. So when we saw the situation we were in, which was a sudden one, but turned out to be sustained, when we got back from walking, the lead had opened from 600 or 800 meters to about a mile, and piled on the drift ice was the windward side, the shore ice was the leeward side, so it was driving across this ever-widening lead all of this slush ice, which we could manage if it was calm, a non-problem. But as the lead got wider, and it was generated very fast, we ended up with ice in front of us that we could neither walk on nor paddle through because it was very, very thick slush. And we realized by about midnight, tried until we were exhausted. The kayaks tied together, a very stable catamaran type structure. We tied the kayaks together. It was howling, probably 60, 65 knots. 18 below. It was pretty tough going. And tied the kayaks together. We had worked our way away from the drifting ice. Well, we were hundreds of yards out, but still the lead is getting wider and wider. Exhausted, could no longer get through the slush ice. Tied the kayaks together. Survived the first night. Early the next morning. This is in November. The days are very, very short. It took shelter in the kayaks, which is not much shelter. I mean, there's no pressure ridges, no nothing, just frozen slush ice. And when it solidified and started itself piling up, we bailed out of that, untied the kayaks, went back to the drifting ice. But by that time we could walk on it. But we still could never get to where we wanted to go. As you can visualize the picture of the fast ice drifting further and further out to sea, and the lead becoming immensely wide. And we spent the first 3 days being blown very rapidly into the Bering Sea from Norton Sound. The next 2 days, after the wind stopped, we would we knew that we had to try and stay as close to Norton Sound as possible. So we were on a treadmill. The ice was drifting southwest. We were drifting southwest towards St. Lawrence Island into the Bering Sea proper. And we knew we were on just this treadmill trying to maintain position. Long story, hard to go into. And we couldn't get much sleep really, because as soon as you sit down for any period of time, you just, be shuddering. I had the best gear. Anthony had the best gear. We had full sealskin clothing. We had good reindeer skin parkas. We had an outside parka of ground squirrels. We had the best hunting equipment. And on the end of the third day, the wind died down, and then finally switched to the southerly, so we were now on ice that was going the same direction that we were walking. So we were going, it's sort of like walking on what do you see in these airline terminals?
Escalators.
You can move pretty fast.
Yeah.
And so we kept going and going, and ended up eventually back at the same spot where we started out, but it took about 7 days to do it.
Wow. Did you have enough survival food with you that you were able to take in some calories?
No, we were able to hunt. We got a ring seal, and these things get complicated. But as Karen will tell you, COWCH is a prepared food. It's as prepared as cooking it. And so we had a seal. We got a seal. We knew then that we had no problems. We butchered it, cut it up, put it inside our kayaks. We ate COWCH, which is frozen meat. And people would say, it's raw. Nah, it's not raw. It's COWCH. COWCH is COWCH. And so we had food. We kept our gear. We never abandoned a thing. We like to think we said the right prayers. It was tough go. But, folks who drifted away on the ice and ended up, 18. If you ever want to read a real story, read a very small book about a guy, King Islander, who was one of these multiple teachers that I had. When I started hunting on the ice, I'm going to backtrack here. It's like going to the university, or like sitting down with your peers at a conference, or like sitting down with the people that you're really working with together on the same project. Inevitably, when we talk about science, our version of science and what science is, night after night after night, there were always, combined with joking and laughing and storytelling and ivory carving, all going on at the same time, recounting events of the day. Gregory Ayok was a very, very good guy, a good teacher to me, and he just always would get into these discussions about what to do under what circumstances. Sort of like talking with an experienced pilot if you want to become a pilot. What do you do when it stalls? What do you know?
Mm-hmm.
It's the same schooling. It's about as formal as anything I've ever attended. And it goes on all the time. All the time. If you're receptive to it. If you want to stay home and watch television, which we didn't have in those days, you had to make the effort to go down to the community hall and sit down and listen, just like you do. That's where it's at. That's where it's at if you want to try and understand something. That's a formal education. That's a formal education. It's a time and a place. It's in the evening, and little tricks about not cutting off your circulation, opening all your laces, how to make water. We had the intestine of a bearded seal tied off at one end on a long thong. You don't want to eat snow, and you just pack that thing full of snow. You put it inside your parka, and you've got your traditional thermos. Now we have other things.
Today I use a Ziploc bag for the same thing.
Well, I couldn't recount all the points, But there was a strength, and this is not an ego thing. I was very receptive and very wanting to know those things. So, because there was something that will put to common application. That's one aspect of learning. The other aspect, depending on the person you're associated with, will never tell you anything, but always provide you the opportunity to participate. That's another way of teaching, of course, very common. On King Island and Diomede, a father never taught his son the hunting skills. It was always a specific relationship other than the father. It was usually a maternal uncle. I'm not an anthropologist. I don't know why those things work out. And then there are these relationships, very serious relationships with some people, very joking relationships with others, teasing cousins. Ooh, that gets vicious. But anyway, so, you have to understand all of these kind of relationships, and the oddity of being a total outsider was that they didn't apply. So you could approach anybody at any time, and, just like normal human beings, they either take the time to show you or tell you. But there's always reciprocity involved. Always, always, always. And you just have to assume that from the beginning, and that's the way it should be in all our relationships. Remember what I told you, there has to be some benefit. For anybody that's sacrificing anything, including their time, there has to be some reciprocity.
In your case, you were a young man out there, and in many ways, you were trying to take in a tremendous amount of information. What was your reciprocity to them, do you think?
It's hard to. There's so many interesting things. My domestic colony was. I'll just use one of minuscule examples. Yeah. Or the domestic colony. What do you? How the hell? Why are you doing this? So you get involved in explaining all that sort of stuff. Every aspect of it. You're looking at walrus teeth, and they're just tree. Why? If they're telling me about driftwood, I'm telling them about other things. And doing the dissections on the air sacs. Well, I want to understand the anatomy. This anatomy relates to buoyancy, and it relates to ability to stay at this walruses. So it's always this kind of tay-to-tay. But if you're living and working in a setting like here, which is a fine setting for science, it's close to an academic institution, you can really focus on it. All of these things I'm talking about, in some ways, are a distraction with relation to time. But that's where I was at, because the nexus is the animals that I was interested in and the people who at that time were part of that ecosystem. I don't know that it exists now. I just can't answer that question.
Yeah, I had some of the same...
time change. A year is a year and a day is a day, but a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades in relation to the cultural transition that is occurring in Alaska are almost like accelerated time.
Yeah.
I have question back to the story you were just telling about drifting out on the ice before we move on to the other things, is what that experience ended up meaning to you the rest of your life.
Oh. Well, you know, that experience and my partner, who was involved with it at the same time, Anthony and I were together, both at that time fairly accomplished sea mammal hunters. What that meant to the rest of my life? Well, it meant something that's very intangible. Every year of my life after that is a gift. I think about it often. So this has nothing to do with professional commitment. It has to do with relationships with my children, relationships with my grandchildren. I mean, to be gifted at least a continued opportunity to do something makes you think about what's worthwhile doing, makes you think about what's not worthwhile doing. In the sense of my professional career, especially with the native people, it was one of those intangible events that said, hey, and many times, you know, this guy did it. He knows what we go through. He knows what we're exposed to. He's faced it. He's dealt it with it. He's still coming back here. I cannot measure the value of that sort of thing, but I know in many, many, many years and years of subsequent encounters, it says, you know, it has put me in a position of being able to sit down and talk one-on-one, no holds barred. It's put me in a bad position because when I speak a lot of times with some of the younger kids, you know, I roll in my eyes and say, holy smokes, God, if you only knew what your grandparents went through. You asked me a very difficult question. I don't know how to put that in total perspective. I really don't. It really generated my interest in the study of sea ice dynamics, which is immediately what I focused on here with Lou Shapiro and the people on, becoming really trying to understand the dynamics of this very, very interesting substance and how it excludes or permits occupancy by all manner of fish, birds, marine mammals. And that's where I got into this whole topic of habitat partitioning depending on ice type and an understanding of sea ice dynamics. I mean, been there, man. I know what I can walk on. I know how thin it is. You know, when we had to wait for newly frozen pieces to overlap so we could walk along the fringes of it. When we knew that to get snow on that new ice, there was none, and we had to wait until the floes were grinding against each other because that physical process of grinding and making that little furrow, that ice is mostly salt-free, whereas everything around it is, and that's the stuff we put in. What can I say? I mean, it was an epiphany event in many, many aspects, including spiritual. I don't ever want to do it again. I don't wish it on anybody. The majority of the people that have experienced that for that length of time aren't around to tell the tale about it. We were fortunate. It's one of these other things. I haven't done anything but be lucky. What can I say? Hard penetrating question. I don't know the dimensions to this day. That's 50 years ago. 45 years ago. I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, you did just answer it.
Sure.
Yeah. That was an event when you were still working out in Nome yet. You've described how you continued marine mammal research after you came to Fairbanks. You mentioned briefly that at one point you had been promoted to the marine mammal coordinator for the department.
Yeah.
Is that the position you had with the department at the point you retired?
That is.
Okay. And when did you retire?
1986.
Okay.
1986 was an interesting time. I told you before that the minerals management OCS program, Outer Continental Shelf Environmental Assessment program, was in full swing. I was fortunate enough, although with some weeding, it was a little harsh in the sense that with the department at that time, I don't know what it's like now, people were on probation for the first year of their job there.
Yeah.
And remember, I told you I started working as a commercial fisherman. That's a no nonsense business. You don't succeed by trying; you succeed by succeeding. And I took the just as it was in my own personal case. In that year of probation, if those folks were not just good, but really producing in the first year when they were essentially on probation, pretty harsh. I figured they were never going to. If they didn't do it in the first year, if they didn't make a significant above average attempt in their probationary year, I didn't want any part of them. Is that hard? I don't know. But the folks that stayed went on to do a lot of good things. Well, anyway, by the middle 80s, the funding for the OCHEP program was dying. There was a pretty big staff. I was then trying to do research and doing research as well as running, coordinating. And we know what the coordinator's position is. You can be a full-time coordinator. Remember, I told you the commissioner got on me for not being by my phone. But anyway, budgets were tight and everything else, and I was starting to get the wanderlust, and it was a good time. There were two people that could stay on for the salary that I was getting as one person, and they were younger and more enthused and wanting to charge ahead, and so I said, that's a good time to retire. And there's another thing, and this is my humorous side of retirement. Remember the experiments that you read about that were false and had to do with genetics and environment? Lamarck's experiments of cutting tails off rats for generation after generation, assuming that eventually rats without tails would be born, right? And of course it was found to be not true, that environment doesn't shape those kinds of things in the short term. Well, I think he was partially right, because I know that the closer I got to being eligible for retirement, the longer my middle finger got. That's a joke. That's joking. Anyway, I didn't retire when I was eligible for it. I stayed on for several years after that. And I got the urge to go back to some of the other things that I was exposed to much earlier in my life. I wanted to go to sea as a fisherman, and I couldn't. There was a conflict of interest when I was working for the department. I wanted to spend more time in the winter living in a more remote part of Alaska. It's just, as you get older, you realize that it isn't now when you're charging ahead and full of gusto and in the middle of your career and all that sort of stuff. But there comes a point when you realize that probably the most important commodity that one has is their time. It's the most important coin that you have to spend. And how you spend it is worthy of some thought. And as you become real old, I'm about 70, that coin becomes the most valuable that you have. What do you want to do with it? So I split my time amongst marine mammal research still. In fact, I'm dying today to meet some deadlines. Commercial fishing, which is where I started as a youth, and enjoying the solitude and peace of a small community in the winter. That's it. Pretty straightforward.
I'd like to talk a little bit about all three of those facets. First, in terms of the marine mammal research, what sort of things have you, obviously when you retire now you've got a little bit more flexibility perhaps in really focusing on the stuff you enjoy or captivate you. What scientific facets have you continued on with your marine mammal research? And also, I know that you also have been doing some of these types of oral interviews with some of the native elders as well. What tack did you go on first of all with the marine mammals and some of the interviews?
Well, at first I continued exactly what I was doing with the Department of Fish and Game. As I told you, the federal government was taking over and contracted with private consultants. Well, when I retired, I started my own business. Not that I wanted to be a business person, but I wanted to pursue the same things legitimately, in the sense of being able to acquire the equipment I needed and all of that sort of stuff, and have a legitimate business to write off expenses, which are great working in remote parts of Alaska, against income. So that required a certain approach to the issue. And now with various consulting companies, with federal agencies, with North Slope Borough, people that have specific needs but don't have the available staff, or are expanding a program that they know will eventually end and don't want to put on permanent people. Mm-hmm. There's been a great opportunity, not seeking work, but people, if you like much of the bowhead work up in the Beaufort Sea that's not done under the auspices of either NIMS or the North Slope Borough. That's related to monitoring seismic activities, the impact of seismic activities. People call and say, "Would you join us? Because we're going to do something that we need somebody to." They don't want to pay for the gear up time. They don't want to pay to teach somebody how to do this sort of stuff. And you well know that many of the people that have retired that you are aware of have a niche because of their experience, mm-hmm. and they are in demand. And that's how I pursued it, but very narrowly. I mean, I'm not pursuing work for the sake of work. It has to be very much focused on, one, what I feel I can competently do, and two, on mammals. I don't like the airplane, the distant overwater airplane survey work that a lot of it is being done. I do it. I could spend the entire year every year doing subcontract work on marine mammals, but some of it is not challenging. If I'm going to do bowhead work in the Beaufort Sea, I view it as doing the work that they need done, an opportunity to actually see and learn and observe what's going on with regard to movements and relationships to sea ice and to, zooplankton abundance. I mean, you just have to be uncomfortable enough that you're constantly never satisfied. You have to be, I can't say you have to be. It has to be an opportunity to scratch a little deeper and a little harder at the same things you're trying to go on. So these are not, I live in 3 worlds in the course of a year. The people that I interact with in each one barely know of or about or are interested in the folks in that other world. That's just the way it is. The fishing guys, what the hell does a PhD mean to them? And I'm looking at sea lions, and all they see are things they don't like at all. Or killer whales. Killer whales are the big problem right now, so I'm grooving on these killer whales. What? It's kind of interesting. And living in Mitchumina, that spun off to dealing with folks in McGrath and Tecate, and just on the close route that wanted to get rid of fur, and so I tried to learn enough about grading fur to become a fur buyer. And the best accident that ever happened was when my plane got crashed a year ago, this coming August, because everybody was, my old friends, that I didn't buy fur. I bought them almost on consignment. I bought them, gave them money on the barrelhead, sold them, and rebated anything that was above and beyond my expenses plus a little more. So, it wasn't a matter of. It was a very interesting, different way to do it. What's a reasonable return on your investment? Hard question. It depends, Most people would say, well, it's the max you can get, whatever it is. Well, no, it doesn't really work that way, as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, last year, several people in the fall called me up, and they wanted to either send me or have me come to buy their fur, and I didn't have a plane to get around, and as it worked out, the absolute bottom dropped out of the market. I probably would have lost tens of thousands of dollars in that venture. Glad. No. You see, things, seemingly negative things, sometimes have a very positive turn on them.
Sure.
I mean, I would have had a tough time.
So
Anyway.
So
these worlds are not totally, although they're very, very different, they're kind of in line with, I mean, I love the commercial fishing. I love it because it's a real activity in which you don't say, well, the experiment went wrong, but it was good because we learned what our mistakes were. So you still get your pay for screwing up really badly. There's no BS with regard to these things. Either you get enough to pay your expenses or you fail. And there's something positive about hardcore risk and reward. I like it. It's a no BS thing. I admire the highliners. They're very good observers. They're very driven. They're very competent in many, many aspects. It's a nice community to be associated with. Rural living is the cathedral. It's psychologically and spiritually recharging. I don't know if you've ever seen Minchuman. It's an absolutely beautiful place. A little cold. It's a cold spot, but not only is it a touch with reality, but it's a touch with whoever gets in touch with the inner self. I don't really know what that means. All I know is that there's something about it that is satisfying. Not in the sense of catching a lot of fish, catching a lot of fur, meeting a research report deadline, but something that's very, very fulfilling. You have to like solitude. Most people that try it love it and leave it very rapidly.
So that's what you're referring to when you go out to spend a good part of the winter at Minchumina. You're trapping yourself.
Lots of things. A little trapping, a little stargazing, a little watching the mountain, a little bit of writing.
Because you're down there, you can see Denali.
Oh, it's in my backyard. It looms over the place. Yeah. The fishing is no time to do anything, but it's constant.
Now the fishing, the ship gear, you originally started off after you retired. You had a commercial salmon fishing permit for Bristol Bay.
Yes, I still do.
Okay.
Yeah. Bought a boat. Had a good time when I was a permit holder and didn't have boat worries. Bought a boat. Which got me into the whole business of, again, organizing expeditions, all the gear, crew, hiring crew, insurance, license, all of the stuff that goes with interacting with the Coast Guard and insurance, the boat and still go fishing. So there you go. And the boat was a lucrative venture. I mean, had it made from scratch. Very competent, capable. Used it as a charter vessel. Took research charters out on it. So I don't know how to explain this, but there are three very different activities, mostly seasonally related.
Now, recently you've also bought a halibut IFQ.
I bought them back in when would the IFQ program come in? Yeah, that's just an expansion of fishing.
Okay.
A different kind of fishing.
In what area of the state do you do that in?
Aleutian Islands and the Gulf of Alaska. Yeah. It's real fishing. It's not in the bay. It's nice. Hard work. It's kind of interesting to be able to, it's kind of interesting to realize that once you set the gear in motion, you may be 35 hours before you're done. That's a little bit hard as I get older, but part of the drill.
And so the salmon fishing is a certain segment of the year, and then the halibut fishing...
I start halibut fishing usually in May, although I started in April this year. Salmon fishing is June and July, and then back to halibut fishing in August and early September. So halibut, salmon, halibut. But I think, like I said, I'm running out of time. The one that is the easiest, but I don't know. I think I can save 2 months of my annual year and devote to other things if I get out of salmon fishing. The halibut fishing is real deep ocean fishing. The bird life is phenomenal. This April, to be able to stand on the stern and look at 3 different species of albatross in view at the same time is kind of interesting.
So, Tom, you want to talk a little bit about wildlife management, wildlife conservation, and how that's evolved through John's career?
Yeah, it's a good juncture for that. I mean, you've been up here now, so you got up here basically right about the time of statehood. You've observed many changes over the course of that in terms of the Native Claims Settlement Act in 1971, the National Interest Lands Conservation Act in 1980, and you know, especially ANILCA has brought in some dramatic changes in terms of state and federal relationships on wildlife management, particularly in the terrestrial lands. What are some of your observations on some of these changes? You know, have some of these, in your view, been positive? Have some of them been setbacks for conservation? I mean, it's kind of a broad question, but
Well, that's a very, very difficult question. Well, I think if you start and look at, start and just project sort of the generality. It's statehood, 1959, and probably the first 10 or 15 years after were really a flush of very great enthusiasm. There was not the, we were in control of our own destiny, our value, the primary value, the primary resources of the state were in almost pristine condition, except for salmon, particularly. And people were looking collectively, from all over, were looking towards a really, really bright future. Many things changed almost simultaneously. When Alaska became a state, the responsibilities for education meant that the Bureau of Indian Affairs was phased out, state education phased in, that federal management of resources was phased out, state management was phased in, on and on and on for every responsibility that a state government had to assume. Wow, those were heady days. I mean, we had, from my perspective, the fish and wildlife resources. We were very, very fortunate enough to have at the time, folks that came up, they came from a different time. Most of them were, if you interviewed many, most of them were veterans that had been either through the Second World War or the Korean War, which gives people a different perspective on lots of things, lots and lots of things. Most of the folks I worked with, even though I was never in the military, were vets and were. When I went to North Carolina State, very interestingly enough, 85% of the students were there on the GI Bill. Most of them were Korean War veterans. And that had an influence too. It really did. I don't know how to answer your question, but we had the encouragement to pursue what was collectively recognized through these annual game division meetings as priority issues. When Alaska became a state, we didn't have to fight years and years and years of litigation and everything else to establish 2 of the gems in the world type refuges, McNeil River and the Walrus Islands. Things could be done. They could be done in an expeditious manner, for better or for worse. And then as things became more and more polarized, naturally, you can't lament it or regret it, people started to look more and more not so much towards the common good, which can be carried to excess, as to the sort of rights and privileges of, we are pushing an agenda in this country of diversity and sort of acknowledging it, whereas when you look at the rest of the world, you realize that the potential pitfall of that is tribalism, and tribalism is chaos. And so how are we going to resolve that? We won't resolve it, because we're in the United States, because we're just not going to resolve that. And in fact, it won't be resolvable until it collapses. That's just the way things work out with us. But we have been pursuing a really interesting and divisive sort of agenda, and it relates to everything. The divisiveness is sometimes good when things get a full airing. We're going through one issue in Southwest Alaska, for instance, where all parties, fishermen, conservationists, everybody is going to voice their opinion, and that's the big mine at the head of in Bristol Bay.
Proposed Pebble Mine.
The Pebble Mine. That's a major event, and I think in that respect, the airing of all these things. Right now, it's very hard to do anything, especially at the federal level. At the state level, things can still be done with a great amount of local involvement because we have local advisory committees. Some don't function, but the option for them to function is there to any participant from any part of the state at any time. We still have wide open board meetings. I spoke to many board members over the years, and they say the biggest problem is there's so much public participation that it's overwhelming. Not that it's not valuable or important, but things can be done, and we seem to be able to. It's taking longer and longer and longer to reach a decision, and a longer process to implement those decisions. So things get drawn out because of this greater involvement with a more and more refined bureaucracy and political system. That's reality. And anything can be stopped at any time through the court system. Management in Alaska now is quite chaotic because there are three, instead of just, for instance, user, including native interests and the state, interacting, recommending, suggesting, objecting to, supporting. We have three things. And if a community, a user group community or a protection group community is opposed to what the state wants to do, instead of this headbutting at a more local level, they'll either go through the court system or the federal system. So that when you multiply this potential judicial and bureaucratic involvement by one, that's not an arithmetical increase in complexity. That's a geometric increase. And so anything can. It's hard to do anything. If you want to go to the basics, try intensive management as a conceptual thing and see how that works. So here you have native people and rural people strongly supporting it, the state strongly supporting it, and it's either stop. How expensive is it to actually implement? And the obstructionists in that view make it as difficult as possible so you can realize that. They hope you realize it's not cost effective. They don't even do it. So where's the resource on all this? The resource gets lost in the philosophical debates. The resource gets lost in the political debates. I'll go back to beluga whales in Cook Inlet, in the backwater of the largest city in the whole state, coming up Ship Creek. I remember getting inebriated, which is another word for drunk, in the crow's nest in the Captain Cook, watching beluga whales in Ship Creek.
Wow.
It was one of the most enjoyable summer evenings I've ever spent.
When was that, John? Do you remember?
That was about I was in Anchorage at the time for a meeting with probably about 1969. But there were lots of belugas then.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another example. You talk about management. This is a difficult one. This is a very hard one. There is an exemption with regard to marine mammals for Eskimos, Indians, and Aleuts. Well, let me back up. Before I get into that, I have a view about people that people are people. And that is, there are opportunists, there are folks that are committed, there are, all of that sort of stuff. I remember when the first state, on one of the major issues, tried to deal with accommodating the need for income in rural communities. Number one, tying that to reducing waste of a potentially saleable component. And the other tie was subsistence fishing. And this had to do with the legalization of the sale of roe from subsistence caught fish. This is like the walrus issue. These are not unrelated. So you end up, in good faith, for the majority of people on all sides, dealing with a commodity that had a very high value, which was roe, from a commonly shared resource, which was salmon, of varying run strength. So what did we have? We had, all of a sudden, when it was made legal, we had this tremendous explosion of subsistence fishing effort and of catch, resulting in real economic inflow to certain rural communities, but at tremendous waste of salmon that were stripped for their roe. It's an interesting dilemma, isn't it? So what is the connection between weighing off all of these things? Well, walrus are the same issue. They're available, they're present, they're the only resource that can be easily commercialized for ivory. What is the dilemma of the last 5 decades? Ivory. Bowheads are falling into that category, actually, because they're the byproducts are valuable. You can recoup all your expenses under new federal tax regulations as it goes on. You know, we ended up with 3 huge whales taken at gamble by folks that were more interested in all of the, how do I put this, intangibles associated with being a successful whaling captain. None of the 3 had ever successfully killed a whale, but there were lots of them there. They were at that time hunting with London boats quite far off. 3 50-plus footers were taken. The folks, the majority of the old timers, were in horror, same day. It's not like Barrow where they haul them up on them. And what was the end result? Minimal salvage, and I mean, 3 50-plus footers basically cast adrift because nobody shows up to butcher them. Whose fault is it? Well, can't cast blame. It was just one of those things which is the juxtaposition of prestige, opportunity, no forethought about the end result. So when if you put bad things together and bad things, 3 whales that were basically cast adrift amount to about all the walruses that were in tonnage, but it's not. The native people themselves, now they're in control to a large extent of their own destiny. The Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission has done great things. It's a classic model that basically works most of the time because it's focused on something that formerly had no real commercial value. Everybody knew what was going on, restricted in location where it was done, but even they have not wrestled with the real issue of the whales. We have, and I'm with them 100%, do everything I can to support them. First it was a real challenge to continue whaling for subsistence and cultural identity. That battle is won. Everybody can continue to whale. More and more whales are allowed in the quotas as the whale population increases. Now, what is the negative side of all of that? We're coming to that point now. So the whalers themselves have to grasp, now have to start thinking seriously, not about them and their culture and the whales' role that they play in that, but the whales. Whether they can do it or not in the future, I don't know. It's getting harder and harder for them. But, that will never come to the fore. I mean, you talk about what I do. I write letters to people who, not outside of it, say, hey, somebody you can talk to and say, you got to focus on this, guys, keep it out of the media and just work on it. Get it done. This shouldn't happen. It has nothing to do with traditional, the Inuit of the whale. It has nothing to do with traditional respect. It has, it flies in the face of all of that. So that's another little role. You know, I'm an old
Yeah.
man now. You just keep prodding and digging and try and do something constructive. Stay out of the firing lines. Stay out of
Right.
the firing lanes. You know, keep the small arms fired down. Not, you know, but that's how you do it.
Yeah. What is
But the management. You asked me a question I did not answer. The management has definitely changed. It becomes much more, instead of cooperative, it becomes adversarial. That perhaps is the natural evolution of maturity of all the vested interest parties. It's harder and harder to get people to work towards a common goal. You have the native people, the rural, not just native, but the rural people wanting intensive management to enhance a resource that they depend on, which it's the advocacy and sort of stances that run the whole gamut of participants, ranging from animal rights folks to opportunist plunderers. That's the array of people you're working with. We're in the middle of it. We can, at the state level, you can work more effectively, not necessarily successfully, because the channels are more direct, the interaction is more frequent. When you get dealing with a larger bureaucracy farther removed, you know, one thing I learned in many, many years is there's a continuum with regard to where the management, or the management is the only term I'll use here. If you're so close to the resource, you have no hope in doing other than what's beneficial in the short term. You could no longer conceive of the fishermen in Bristol Bay managing the Bristol Bay resource. That would be demolished in one generation of fish generation, because it's short-term immediate need. And then on the other hand, so that's too close. That's too close and too dependent on the resource to be really in a managerial mode. Just like I said before, people are people. That's the way it is. I mean, we only need about 4,000 years of watching that process to focus on what was a burning interest, and that's what I did.
yeah.
You know, I got to be the regional supervisor because of default, and I was kept in that position as a prisoner until I could find a replacement who was suitable to the people in Juneau.
Was that Lloyd?
No, that was Dick Bishop. I'm not talking about marine mammals.
Oh, so you were the regional supervisor
Absolutely.
of the game division.
Yeah.
Well, now that's a. Now, how did you get? Let's get that on tape. I see. I didn't know.
No. That's an odd thing. See, people are always supposed to want to go up, and up, right?
Right.
Bob Hinman was the regional supervisor. He was transferred to
Are
Juneau.
you taping now? Good.
Oh, this is just an incident in.
Yeah.
An
Now when
anomalous
this
incident.
was in the early 1980s then?
You know, I don't remember the time. Probably the early 1980s, and
And you were.
I was at a senior level in the department here. I was a statewide coordinator for marine mammal programs.
Okay.
Period, and the regional supervisor was Bob Hinman.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you ever knew Bob.
I've heard the name. I've never met him.
And Bob Hinman took a job in Juneau as the deputy director of the game division. So the vacancy was there, and they were recruiting to fill that vacancy. The director was Bob Rausch, a dear friend, mentor, tormentor. You know, the whole gamut.
Now, there's two Robert Roush.
Yeah, one is Dr. Robert A. Rausch, or Robert L. Rausch, whose house we're sitting in.
He's a parasitologist.
He was U.S. Public Health Service and then University of Alaska, world-renowned parasitologist.
Yeah.
And Robert A. Rausch, who worked for the Department of Fish and Game in many capacities, primarily worked on moose in his younger days. Well, he had risen to the rank of director of the Division of Game, maybe the assistant director. I think it was director of the Division of Game. I had risen or floated to the rank of statewide marine mammals coordinator. So when Hinman moved to Juneau, they started to recruit for the position of regional supervisor. And in the meantime, Rausch, Fish and Game Rausch, asked me to fill in until they got somebody. And I did. And they were recruiting. I moved in there, which was his chess and checker game. I moved into that position, which is exactly what he wanted. And, about every month I'd call Juno, how's recruiting going? How's recruiting going? And he'd say, oh, we haven't found anybody. Well, what's the lifeblood of these places? The secretaries. They know what's happening. They know who's doing what to whom and all of that sort of stuff. And finally his secretary said, John, they quit recruiting months ago. So then I tumbled, they had no intention of recruiting somebody. And so Rausch was a very interesting person, captain in the Marine Corps, in North Korea when the Chinese came across, been seen a lot of stuff. And so I called him up and I said, this is my superior, you've been feeding me a line of you-know-what. And he didn't take, he had a pretty thin skin, although he was hard on everybody around him. So he blew his stack and told me that he's very disappointed. Everyone he ever hired, which he didn't hire me, Jim Brooks did, should aspire to become the commissioner, eventually become the commissioner, and blah, 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 blah. That was not an aspiration I had. But anyway, he cooled off. And I says, well, all of that's well and good, Bob, but what are we going to do now? So finally, in a bluster, it was amazing. He says, that's true. And you're going to keep that position until you find somebody who is acceptable to me. So then the recruiting fell on my shoulders, and it had to be acceptable to him. Well, immediately, the person I thought of, which would be absolutely the right temperament, the right way, and the right person to interact with all of the personalities that you deal in an ever increasing bureaucracy, trying to keep him as best. We've constantly gone off course for some chaos collectively, for some minor chaos. Well, anyway. There was a young man who had done yeoman's work for the department, had served in McGrath, had his family down in McGrath. They liked living out in the woods, worked on moose, and that was Dick Bishop, who was thoroughly enjoying living in Minchumina with his 2 children and 3 children and his lovely wife, Mary. But they were getting to be about high school age. So I flew, in fact, one of the pilots here, in the Beaver, took me to Minchumina. And I sat down with Richard and explained to him why he had to take his kids into town to go to high school, because they were homeschooled. Mm-hmm. Being homeschooled, not that it put them in any bad case or anything, but I should say they're not, they'd be wonderfully intelligent homeschooled kids that don't know how to interact. Anyway, we had a long discussion on a late summer day with Mount McKinley there. And he said no. And but eventually I prevailed, and so he agreed to come into town to take over the job of regional supervisor. No. I called Rausch. This is a long time. I'd been in that position about a year and a half. It was 75 actually, because it was the year of the great caribou decline in the western Arctic caribou herd, and I spent Christmas and New Year's in Barrow with Eben Hobson, who I dearly admired, but took a strange political position on that issue. But anyway, I'm doing caribou surveys on New Year's Day with no daylight, but light, at a barrow. And anyway, so that's the time I remember that.
So this is just, I guess, for posterity. This is an interesting thing. You were a Marine mammal person, and now as the regional supervisor, you're overseeing moose and caribou and
still
wolves
trying to do marine,
and small mammals and everything.
Every research program in the region. Anyway, which was fun. Again, and it's sort of like going to school when I went to school, because my interest was still marine mammals, and we had a lot of programs going. But anyway, so Rausch agreed that, Dick Bishop would be acceptable to him. So I scooted back down the ladder as fast as I could. And Dick became my boss. it's like every election, you know. I always advise the people at election time in a job like in a state job, who is governor is somewhat important, because you get there's certain positions that are political appointees, the commissioner and all that sort of stuff. So I say, well, there's a period of time here for about 6 months when you address everybody, man and woman, as sir, because you never know who the hell's going to be your boss.
Yeah.
You don't say madam anymore. I guess it's impolite. I don't know what you say to women. Anyway, we got to wrap this up.
I guess maybe
Anyway, it's ever in the times. What's fascinating to me is that the understanding of the resources we're dealing with becomes more and more sophisticated. The technology to attempt to understand them becomes more sophisticated, to the point where some people prefer to deal with virtual populations rather than real populations, and models rather than, models are very good as a tool. In my day, a model was a theory. Theory and model mean the same thing to me. And it's nice to understand the important interfaces that maybe you should focus on, but, we can't really predict all the time with our fancy models. They are important. They're useful tools and a useful exercise to go through to recognize what the key, most important driving forces are. But nonetheless, I hope the folks that came up the way I did and that did the way I did are dinosaurs. And the folks that come along behind us, as I did, I had the great luxury of not starting out at the beginning, whether it was the rural native people that I dealt with. You start out, if you have anything going for you at all and realize it, you start out standing on their shoulders. That's where you start from. And when you end up, you better have somebody else capable of standing on your shoulders. That's what the hell it's all about. That's why we know how to write. That's why we write books. That's why we store information. We convey information. So, it's a lazy son of a gun that always has to start out at ground zero. And if you take that approach, you be careful and respectful and dig into what's been done and how it's been done. It is important to me who's done it. When I don't particularly like to. I was offered an opportunity by Larry Irving. You don't know who Larry Irving is. Karen knows of him. He was a great philosopher and a great scientist.
Oh, Lawrence Irving?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he was the chairman of my PhD committee. And but anyway, he invited me to join the Explorers Club in New York. I was still living at Nome at the time. And Anthony and I had, just a couple of years after our learning experience on the ice. And I said, Larry, how do you get selected or nominated or whatever the process is? And it was about, doing these certain sorts of things. And I said, I have a candidate that probably deserves it far more than I, which was Anthony. And Larry paused. He didn't say anything, and then I got to wondering about the Sherpas that go to the top of Mount Everest, the native people that live in that environment as a normal course of day-to-day activity. We're just interlopers, exposed to it for a short period of time. And it turned out that what they were looking for was not so much the folks that did it as a routine, but those that mastered it as sort of novice interlopers. And when then I nominated Anthony and said, no, I would join, if Anthony could join with me. And it worked out that it wasn't Larry. He understood fully. And then finally he said, I guess you're not interested. And I said, you're right, I am not interested. So it was kind of an interesting take on things.
Well, kind of the last question I wanted to finish up with, since your retirement, you've had kind of a three...
Well, wait a minute, let's start. The only way I know I'm retired is when I go to bed at night, I'm tired, and when I wake up the next morning, I'm tired, so I'm retired in that capacity. But it's been a continuation of the same plus a few additional issues that would be conflicts of interest had I been working.
Right, and as you mentioned, there's kind of like three parts to your year. There's a part of time when you're at Minchumina, there's a part of time fishing, and then there's a part of time when you focus back more on the marine mammal
Correct.
research. Now, I suspect all three of these interests have led you into where now you are actually conducting some of these interviews with some of the older native people. And can you explain kind of what you're trying to capture in those interviews?
Well, I've been involved in several projects over the years. This beautiful young lady here, Karen Brewster, is the recipient of the mistakes. But, remember what I said about sort of people coming, not having to have their own staff or anything. But the North Borough, as an example, when was that, in the late 80s?
88.
There was a very, very insightful guy, Tom Albert, Dr. Thomas Albert, and others, but he was the one that carried the water, so to speak, that realized that the Naval Petroleum Reserve Alaska was going, again, at some point in time, to be the focus of petroleum hydrocarbon exploration. And he spent a lot of his time trying to incorporate into the information base some of these things that we've been talking about over the years. Remember I told you those people are teachers, and they're knowledgeable teachers. But it takes some effort to capture that information in a manner that it's available. Not having a written language, it's all oral. And traditional scientists, I would say, just will write that off as anecdotal information. It's far more than that. It's useful information. So he wanted to sort of obtain it, document it, enter it into the publicly available information. And he had a series of projects. This fisheries workshops, the caribou workshops. I mean, there were a whole bunch of things that went on during a period of years, and one of the aspects of that was interview of residents of the NPRA villages. Icy Cape, Wainwright, Barrow, Atkasuk, Nuiqsut. That was about it, I think. And go to the knowledgeable people and do this. Mm-hmm. And make the maps and write the reports. Well, in that particular time, I think he had about $13,000. And by the time I got through the workshops, the caribou workshops, all of the sorts of stuff, got the tapes, ran out of time and money. But the tapes were there. They haven't got so much utility as more recent ones, mostly because, if you had to do it over, if one had to do it over again, you would first go to the knowledgeable people, like Karen, and really focus on the important issues. There are some. Anyway, it had to do with two things: caribou, local knowledge about caribou, local knowledge about fish. Tape recordings, maps, that sort of stuff. More recently, it has not been any biology. It has been, why they came to me, I think, is because, I don't know, I knew the country, felt comfortable with the people, knew the resources, a little bit enough about them. I don't know. But the most recent one was in a very interesting sort of corner of this stuff. It had to do with the cultural significance of polar bears. It has not to do with biology. It has not, it's sort of the metaphysical and the spiritual and all that sort of stuff. And that was, I look at it in an odd sort of a way. The NENA Commission, the Eskimo Polar Bear Commission, they were paying, I took no salary for it. They paid expenses. I considered to be very lucky. They wanted, they said, here's how much, what do you want? And I said, look, you're going to pay me to go talk with all my old buddies. That's what you're going to pay me for. I said, no. I said, we'll figure it out. Minimal wage, minimal hourly wage, and travel expenses. And so I had a grand, absolutely, totally grand, and much more productive, focused. I learned a little bit more about semi-directed interviews, And so it was this beautiful thing of all of these questions that I came to, my own understanding of bears, my own understanding about their environment they live in, and all these things and discussions and questions of 40 years of talking with people, sort of focusing on. I mean, I had some of those interviews are fantastic, absolutely fantastic. It's very hard to get people to cross back, and these were all with elders.
Yeah.
I think the oldest person was 93, and they were all in their late 60s, mostly in their 70s, 80s, 90s. And to cross back into, I'll give you an example. I don't want to dwell on this, take a long time. I was in St. Lawrence Island. No, it was a King Island lady. And she was at King Island when they actually became converts from traditional religion to Christianity. And she worked very closely with the missionary at the time, and still very devout Christian, and but very knowledgeable about the old ways, the celebrations, the role of bears. There are three organisms which share an equal status: the bowhead whale, the killer whale, people, and polar bears. And there's a real reason for that. Killer whales are cooperative hunters. They provide food to the native people in time of stress as beach cast carcasses. Polar bears can function and do very interesting things akin to people, But anyway, that's interesting triumvirate. One is so important that they cannot harm it in any way. In fact, must give it gifts. The other one is an honorable adversary of equal status. So that's an interesting sort of spiritual thing to get into with the Bering Strait community. I can't talk to, I can talk to the ones about the Bering Strait, King Island, Diomede, St. Lawrence Island. Fascinating stuff. But anyway, I started asking this lady questions about the celebrations, and they have special celebrations on King Island. She's a King Islander, and every community has their own different set of ritual proceedings. And I got to asking her about certain things. These continue from one person that's interviewed, gives you a lead, and so you build on it. So I started asking her. I saved her until very late in this process. Started asking her about these questions, and she says, "You shouldn't be talking about that. I'm not going to answer those questions. That's all superstition." Well, I was digging into that sort of stuff. And I knew exactly, that's why they got me, because I knew the people, knew a little bit of background of the people, knew this, that, and the other thing. Anyway, that's how I got it. Well, I'll finish the story and then tell you the beginning of it. Well, anyway, so, okay, I said, Claire, we better have some tea. She was getting very, very upset to start digging back into what was really anti-Christian, what she can, anything that of that nature was against God. So we stopped, we had some tea, this, that, and the other thing, and I finally decided that I think I'm going to go back to this issue, and how am I going to get back there? So we sat down and passed a few pleasantries like we're doing there, relaxing, that sort of stuff. So I said, Clara, I know you don't want to talk about this question I asked you. I said, but I'm not asking you about what you believe. I know what you believe, and said, well, that is superstition to us. I said, I'm not asking you what you believe. I'm asking you what other people did, not what you believe, and not whether it's right or wrong, but what actually was done in the bear celebration, when the bear was put in the place of prominence and the songs were sung to it and all of this sort of stuff, And she sort of relaxed, the break was a good thing, and started getting back into that, sort of detached, and said, this is what they used to do. And we started down that track, which was fascinating. Because the bear had a very, very strong influence, had a very revered place, and now it's... at St. Lawrence Island, for instance, I often wondered, years ago why so few polar bears were taken in the early years. And I came to find out through the course of these interviews that nobody ever went bear hunting. They never pursued bear tracks. They never pursued a bear. The bear had, in fact, to present itself to the hunter. And if it did not, it was free to go. You know. So now they're chased down. They see bear tracks. They get on it with a snow machine. They see them with the lunds, and so the bear kill has gone very, very high, and it was very different. But there's so many stories relating to polar bears that it's amazing.
Are you able to capture?
And the irony of it, when you talk about oral history that never supposedly dies, the most common comment I had is, "You should have been doing this when so and so was alive. We don't know anymore." You know. I hear that over and over again, you know, you should have been doing this 30 or 40 years ago. So it's tough. There's a selective recollection of oral history. Where else do you want to go? We got to quit.
Well, I'm just curious. So these interviews, they've all been conducted in English, or do you have to get an interpreter for any of it?
Some of them, the one with the 93-year-old gentleman from Savunga, from Gamble, was a straight stream of consciousness. I had a good interpreter, an excellent interpreter, and started realizing that this stopping, giving, tay, you know, was probably interfering with his chain of thoughts, and so would strictly ask a question, and he would go. And you know, I'd be looking at Chris. And you know, trying to figure out when I don't understand Siberian Yupik, and when he was done talking, you know, I'd go to the next question. You know, no interference whatsoever. So I've learned something, Karen. I don't know what the hell he said, but Chris Kanuka was the interpreter, and of course I immediately sent him a tape, and you know, he said what was most interesting to him was the guy reverted to very, very, very archaic words for many, many aspects of it, including the name of the bear itself.
So where are those tapes now?
They belong to the Nanak Commission. Didn't I send you a copy of my views on
well, so they're in the possession of the Nanak Commission.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
And what they'll do with them? Unlike me, they'll probably no. I have no idea. I think they've excerpted a lot of them at the university in Nome, and I've heard bits and pieces at elder conventions and that sort of stuff.
So you want to ask your last question, Tom?
That's only an accident of convenience on the part of the guy that wanted to do it. I was going to tell you the beginning. This guy had a very good idea, and he called me up and he wanted to know what I thought about it. I said, "This is terrific." I mean, I ended up conducting interviews at the Alaska Native Service Hospital, you know, with guys and gals. The gals were, you know, there's two worlds, the world of the hunter and the world of his wife, and all focused on the same thing. There's a division of labor towards a common goal, unlike now where you do this and I do this and my wife does this and we maybe interact. You know, but anyway, so this guy contacted me, Charlie Johnson. Charlie Johnson was a diaspora mixed blood Eskimo who grew up in Detroit or someplace like that. And when he came back to Nome, of course, as happens many, many, many times, he really became interested because he didn't grow up in it and he wasn't exposed to it, of capturing as much as he can. This is a management group. And he wanted to find out as much as he could about the cultural significance. Well, it took me a week to try and write down what I viewed in my narrow perception as what the dimensions of cultural significance were. Holy God.
And this is of bear hunting? Or?
Of bears.
Of
not
bears.
of bear hunting.
Polar bears.
Of polar bears. Where they stand in the, you know, the material and the spiritual and the metaphysical and the, you know, and the historical and the storytelling, and they just are, they were major. They're not anymore because they're no longer unusual. I mean, they were hunting them with spears. trying, there's a real difference here. That the ranking has totally changed. So that's what he wanted to do. And so I wrote up all of this sort of stuff, and I sent it back. I says, well, whoever you get to do this is bring it to whoever you want to, but here's my view of the kinds of things. And they related to everything: behavior, natural history, understanding natural history, events, timing, blah, everything. Stories, songs, celebrations, dances. For instance, if a bear is killed at King Island, there is a new dance composed. Unique new dance by the hunter or by his family. But anyway, that's neither here nor there in this moment. It gets very complicated. So he wrote me back, and he said, would you do this? I said, absolutely not. And I wrote back and I said, there are many young people who would give their right eye tooth to get involved in this sort of stuff. And the academicians, if you approach them, it's an opportunity for them to make some bucks on it, either now or in the future, or write a book about it, or do something like that. And I says, there's lots of other people that are more qualified than I am. Fine. About 3 weeks later, he calls me back. He says, we want you to do it. And he said, why? He says, because it's not a big deal. If folks know you, you can sit down with them no matter where, in the living room, on the floor, whatever it is. We want you to do that. Well, back and forth. And finally, he said, write me a proposal. So I thought about it, and then I really did come to realize, hey, I'm getting old. I'll never get a chance to talk to everybody I ever wanted to talk to and ask them all the questions that I forgot about asking, So I wrote him back, and I wrote a proposal, and he came back and he says, how are you going to do this? You're not going to get salary? I said, no, Charlie, you give me minimum wage, whatever that was at the time, and travel expenses, and I'll be happy to do it. And but this is dynamite. I don't want to be responsible for it. And I wrote that letter about intellectual property and all of that sort of stuff and the ownership of it. And I said, if somebody's going to put it up, because every time you record that sort of stuff, it belongs to the people, like the songs that they were singing. Those intellectual private property rights. I didn't want to get involved in those kind of fights. So that was the understanding. They went to him. I paid the informants only because I had a signed receipt, in the sense that they knew what they were doing. They put down their time, wrote out who it was for, all of this sort of stuff. In this day and age, it gets really tight. So it was a great experience. I learned a lot, made all these recordings, much better equipment, farther along, and it was a great experience. And that's the ultimate nexus between what I was doing professionally in my research, connected with local people. You come back 45, almost 50 years later, to the survivors, looking at a different dimension. It opened up a lot of, it brought back this gal that was, one of the gals in St. Lawrence Island broke down in tears, because when I was asking her certain questions, she eventually said, I haven't thought about that stuff since I was 8 years old. What we did, what my mother did, what my father did, all of that sort of stuff. And she was just in tears. She was in her middle 80s, going through. Others that said, I don't remember the songs. I used to fall asleep when they were in the Kazgi, And that's the connection with the clubhouses, the Kazgis, which no longer exist. The center of those things, the celebrations. It was great. One guy in Shishmaref who felt a real spiritual connection with bears, claimed he killed 93 bears in the course of his life, because they kept coming to him, and he did certain things that made them come, and what did he do, and how did he do it, and what was his responsibility when the bear gave itself to him, and of course they were serious. Much different time. They're thinking in very different dimensions. It's hard I would say that it would be very hard for a contemporary, uninformed person to understand what the hell these people are actually talking about. You have to understand animism. The whole concept, the religion of animism. It's not, I don't mean religion in the sense of our institutionalized religions. But that was what they lived under. That was a guiding principle that established mores, that has established many, many things. Because they were equal. It was great. Total diversion. She's getting tired.
No, don't walk away. We have one more question.
No,
I have one more question.
You go ahead.
So how does this relate to, you tell me
I
now.
have one summarizing question. Looking back on your whole career, what might you have done differently?
I would have spent more time really trying to help the males, young men at the time, to become interested and follow through on any of these kinds of pursuits. I don't care if it was geology, ornithology, botany, biology, animal biology. For reasons which I cannot comprehend, there's been a tremendous loss of young men and middle-aged men in this whole process. And it's not from lack of opportunity. It's from some nebulous, to me, not understand. I would try much harder to mentor the young men. I'm not anti-feminist, don't get me wrong. The gals can take care of themselves. They're doing fine. They're graduating from school. They have options for reasons which, I mean, I'm not a sociologist, I don't understand that, but this is tremendous loss of young men who are very capable and willing. I mean, they become hunters, some of them. They're out there, but you can't get them through the whatever hoops, challenges they're facing into the university or to stay in high school or to anything. That's the biggest challenge.
You're referring to within the native population, or?
Well, no, within the rural population, which therefore is predominantly native, but it applies across the board. What is native? That's like the question they ask in Israel: who is a Jew? What is native? Somebody who lives and practices the traditions. Is native by culture or native by heritage? There's a big difference. There's a huge big difference because one, don't get me started on that. And that's where I make that distinction. I've never really made it as concretely as I am at this very, very moment. But I was very interested in interacting with the people who were natives by culture, not necessarily by heritage. And as the native culture changes so much, our biggest fights, disputes is the proper better word, are those that are native by heritage and not necessarily by culture. That's the tribalism business. Well, you asked me a complicated question. What would I do? Remember, I'm an old man, so I think in different terms. What could I have done? And they become... the values change. They change in all our lives. And that's one that I really, truly wish I knew how to grapple with.
Okay. Tom, do you have anything else?
That was the final question that I was going to ask. So, John, thank you very much. This has been fascinating for me, and I appreciate being able to capture a lot of your wisdom on
Well, we didn't go
things.
where I thought we would go, but...